deep down, I think, we just recognized that we needed to change, and it would take time. We've been on that path for a while anyway, but that we needed to change to become a more contemporary company that was basically dealing with the issues that society we're facing today.
Hey, how are you?
I'm fine. Nice to speak to you, Peter.
Yeah, you too. I'm really looking forward to this one. There's loads of topics that we can kind of discuss. We had a little preliminary conversation just before we dived on, and yeah, it was great catching up with you a few weeks back as well. So I'm fully aware that when we dive into this, there's loads of topics to discuss, but I guess the best place to start all good podcasts is who you are, what you do, and why. So I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, well, thanks, Peter. Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity. I mean, my name's Rowan Adams. I work for Tate Lyle, and it's one of the truly great British companies. Just because I work for the company doesn't mean I can say that. And one of the reasons why is because over the last 20 years, we have reinvented ourselves effectively as a sugar reducer rather than the thing that people think we do, which is a sugar producer. We're probably one of the most misunderstood companies in the FTSE because we in the UK don't do what most people think we do. We actually make food healthier. We put nutrition into food, such as fiber and protein, and we take out sugar, calories, and fat from food. And we have gradually transformed the company over 20 years to make that happen. And I'm really pleased to be here to talk about it. I myself, I was born in the Fens in East Anglia. I lived very close to a large sugar beet factory as I grew up. Actually, my very first job was working in that factory after it was closed because it was turned into a wheat store. And I used to test the quality of the wheat as it came in from the lorries. And so I suppose that, food was in my blood from a very early young age. And so it's no surprise that I ended up in the food industry. I've worked for Tate Lyle for about 23 years. I've held a number of roles there, but I suppose the ones that really matter are I was head of strategy for 6 years at the time we sold our sugar business in the UK. And the last 9 years, I've sat on the executive committee as head of external affairs or corporate affairs, as we call it. I suppose the last thing I'll say as introduction is if I had a pound for every time I've had to explain to someone that we are not the Tate & Lyle that you buy the sugar bags in the supermarket, but we're the Tate & Lyle that actually does the opposite and takes the sugar out of food. And when you pick up a cereal or a bar or a yogurt and it has 30% less sugar on the label or added fiber, that's probably us that have made that happen through our ingredients and our technical expertise. And so, I'd be a very rich man if I had a pound for every time I had to explain that we don't make the sugar any longer. But it's great to be here, Peter, and to have a chat with you about the transformation of the company and about the food industry in general.
It's true, because even when we first had that discussion, I was like, oh, Tate & Lyle. But then when we dived into it a little bit more detail, I think in respect to the sale, that's probably the best place to start as to what were the driving factors behind that from you as a leadership team to equally, the more longer term aspirations that you had in play at that point in time.
Yeah, I think, long term is a good phrase to use because I would say that probably the sort of the transformation from sugar refining into a different business started probably in the 70s, but really accelerated at the turn of the century. There's an amazing fact about Tate & Lyle, actually, which is we're a $3 to $4 billion capitalized company. We've been around for 164 years. But we don't own a single asset, a single building, actually a single piece of land today that we owned in the mid-70s. So we've completely re-engineered the whole company in the last 50 years. So everything we built up in the first 110 years, we've since sold. And so that process started in the 70s, and we started buying cornstarch businesses in Europe and the US, and then bought other businesses as we went along. But we got to about 2009, and we said to ourselves, what kind of company do we want to be? And I think that's a very purpose-led question, you might say. And we sat down and said, well, we want to be a company that people are proud of to work for, that motivates our employees. We want to be a company that is doing good in society. We want to be a company that we feel, if I look at it in layman's term, passes the dinner party test. When you're talking to someone next door you've never met before, at dinner or whatever it might be, and they say, who do you work for? What do you do? And you reel off something they're really proud about. And although I, worked in the sugar industry for many years, and I still have a lot of affection for that crop, the reality is sugar wasn't part of that equation for the future of Tate & Lyle. And so we decided that we needed to sell the sugar business, which was mainly the European and the UK business that people are very aware of. We'd sold a few businesses beforehand, but selling the UK sugar business was the really big decision. It was a brave decision because it was the heart of the company, the culture of the company, and it was the company that was founded by Henry Tate back in 1859. But it was the right thing to do because we felt that we wanted to be a different company in a different world that we're living in today, where people want different things to what they wanted in the 1850s and the 1950s.
What was I guess the why keeps on ringing through my head as to, in that point in time, it's amazing to have more longer term aspirations, but there's often a multitude of reasons. Obviously, if we look into the detail of Tate & Lyle of old, there is a fair amount of controversy there, but equally, from a leadership team, it's important to give credit where credit's due as to the fact that you highlighted that the markets have changed and there is more of a desire to galvanize people towards a common cause to have more long-term impacts around people and planet. So I'd love to get your take as to what was discussed in those moments in time.
So whenever you take a big decision like that, the board, the management team, you have to take in a number of factors. And you're right, it wasn't just because we wanted to transform the company into something that we felt was right and fit for purpose for the coming years. There's also economic reasons why, we felt it was the right decision for the company and for our shareholders. Sugar is in those days anyway, it was a highly regulated crop. And we were subject to a number of quotas in a number of countries that we operated in. And, that had some restrictions that made our profits and our cash flow difficult to manage over a long period of time. We had to pay, obviously, dividends to our shareholders. And so there were some economic and good strategic reasons why getting out of those businesses and into businesses where we had more pricing power, where we felt we had more longevity as a company, that was obviously important decision for the board to take. I think also, as I said before, we did a large piece of work, a strategic review of the business back in 2009. And, we looked at, the way the world is moving. People want healthier food. They want more accessible nutrition. Governments want food producers to reduce the amount of sugar, salt, fat in their products. They want more health into food and drink. And so we could see that was the way going forward as well from a sort of industry trends and market point of view. So I think it was a number of decisions, but, deep down, I think, we just recognized that we needed to change and it would take time. We'd been on that path for a while anyway, but that we needed to change to become a more contemporary company that was basically dealing with the issues that society were facing today. Because in the same way that, when sugar was brought into, we started refining sugar in the 1850s and then through that, there was a great deficit of calories in the nation. There's a lot of poverty and malnourishment. And at that time, rightly or wrongly, sugar was seen as a way of providing those calories. And so that was one of the reasons why there were so many sugar producers and people used a lot of sugar. Now I think people look at it differently because science is telling us that, that is not necessarily the way forward. And so we recognized that and decided we needed to change the business. And to do that, we needed to sell our sugar business and move on to other products, which is what we've done.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well because you can compare and contrast to the issues that's occurring at the moment within the geopolitical sphere. Like if you look at just recently, for example, the founder of The Guardian came out and acknowledged their historical linkages to slavery. And then equally, if we look at, the impacts that the sugar industry has historically had, you can't change the past, but it's important to acknowledge it and provide more impact and positive impact for the future.
You can't stop thinking about the link between sugar and slavery because it's there, yeah. In the same way as other things like cotton and various other commodity products. But the reality is, for us, for Tate & Lyle, the business was founded by Henry Tate in 1859, many decades after slavery was abolished. So we were not party to that, although sometimes people think we are, but we're not old enough to be party to that.
Exactly.
Nor was Abraham Lyle, because he founded his business after Henry Tate. So, but there is obviously a link between sugar and slavery, and that can't be in any way, dismissed. And obviously, it was one of the greatest stains on humanity that happened through the whole slave trade and the working on all those sugar plantations. So, no one at Tate and Lyle in any way doesn't accept that, but we weren't party to that, and that is one of the misconceptions that is out there. I think it is less about that why we took the decision to change. We probably would have changed the name if we really felt that was
that's what I was going to dive into, because it kind of I was puzzled as to why you didn't change the name, and then equally I was keen to get your critique on, we talked about long term at the beginning, but I was keen to get your critique on the types of decision making that we see within the political sphere at this point in time, and you just get your take as to what the landscape may look like, what the lay of the land is.
Yeah, I mean, just on the name thing, we didn't change it for a couple of simple reasons. One is, outside the UK, the Tate & Lyle name was never used for the sugar brands that consumers would buy in the shop. So if you're in America, you didn't buy Tate & Lyle sugar, you bought Domino sugar. In Australia, you bought Bundaberg sugar, or in Canada, it was Redpath sugar. It was only in the UK that we used the Tate & Lyle name. Outside the UK, particularly in places like Asia and Latin America, where we weren't doing any sort of sugar business, you might say, at all, but we were increasingly becoming this sugar reducer rather than sugar producer. Our name had a lot of brand recognition as the company we are today. And so we decided that we wouldn't want to throw that in the bin, and that actually it would make much more sense to keep the name, because if you're sitting in Thailand, Asia, or whatever it might be, you don't think of Tate & Lyle as a sugar company, because you never knew that, or you never heard of that. You think of it as the company we are today, which is taking sugar, fat, calories out of food and adding in fiber. So, it was just a difficult decision to take. And the name still has a lot of, we're very proud of the name. We're very proud of our company. The name has a lot of resonance. So we decided to keep it, and who knows what the future holds. But for the moment, we're still called Tate & Lyle.
And from a geopolitical landscape, obviously, the short-termism versus the long-term thinking, I'd be keen to explore.
Yeah, I think this is probably a wider point than just Tate & Lyle, but I think that companies generally, are much better maybe than governments at looking longer term, and that it's really important that we do look at long-term investment and long-term planning for the big challenges that are facing the world at the moment. If you look at, say, and there are many, but if you look at the two, probably the largest ones that I think of anyway in my world, one is climate change, and the other is feeding what is a rapidly growing population and an aging population. And, how are we going to do that in the future? How are we going to solve the climate crisis? How are we going to ensure we have enough food for people? The WWF organization did a review a few years ago, and they worked out that given that the population is going to grow by roughly 2 billion by 2050, so from 8 billion to roughly 10 billion, we're going to have to produce more food in the next 30 to 40 years than we produced in the last 8,000 years to feed this growing population. And we need to do that at a time when agriculture is nearly 20 to 30% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, or food production is about 30% of the world's climate emissions. So we have this really challenging situation where we need to feed more people, but we also need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to reduce climate change impact. And somehow we've got to do both. And science, technology, and all those things are going to be needed to make this happen, more sustainable agriculture. But these things don't happen overnight. And I think we're living in a very short-termist world. I think, decisions now are, you want them immediately because the information is available immediately in the internet or on TV or whatever it might be. And actually, what we need is long-term planning. We need long-term strategies, and we need long-term execution. And the governments, to their credit, are good at some things. They're good at policy making. They're less good at long-term execution and planning. And, I think it's companies who have the real responsibility and opportunity to make a massive difference. And actually, in many respects, to do the work that maybe in the past politicians did, which is to really help plan for the long term. And, that's not easy because you have short-term pressures, particularly if you're a listed PLC like we are. But I think that is absolutely critical. If you're going to really change agriculture in a way that makes a material difference by increasing the soil health or reducing emissions, given that you have different cycles of weather and all those things, that's like a decade or more. So you have to really stick it in. So I think this challenge between a short-term world and short-term political pressure and the need to plan and execute long-term is one of the great challenges as society we face, and maybe companies, particularly purpose-driven companies, are the answer to that.
Yeah, for sure. I think we've talked about it before, about the need to cultivate more future-conscious thinking and behaviour, but equally, I think one of the challenges that companies as well as government have is within the short-term cycles that they operate. So, company has like quarterlies, and then you've got governments that operate in 4-year cycles. Like, ultimately, it's not about the retention of power or the just the short-term profiteering. It's actually more about, what is your proactive approach to the future? What is your roadmap for the next 4, 5, 6, 7 to 10 years down the line? How are you going to execute towards that? Because I think there's an awful lot to be said about that ability to have some kinetic conception to the people that work within your organization and externally, because at this point in time, societal factors, take a look at what's happening in Russia, Ukraine. Like we talk about things like grain and the exportation of grain from Ukraine and like the impact that may have, or further afield, it will end up with issues of huge volumes of displacement of people from different regions of the world as there's a political climate changes. I think businesses and governments need to be a little bit more proactive as to what they're doing. This is kind of one of the founding reasons why I wanted to chat to you guys, because kind of the premise of purpose, like it's one thing to talk about something, but it's a whole other aspect to actually start actioning it. So the question that comes to mind for me is, what does purpose mean to you, and how has it evolved over your 160 plus year history?
Yeah, I think purpose has always been part of Tate & Lyle. We just never necessarily called it that, or we never really gave it a statement or all the things you have to do now, or framework or structure. But it's always been part of it, mainly I think because effectively Tate & Lyle is a number of family companies put together, and those family companies had very strong roots in local communities, and that actually drove a real sense of purpose. We have a lot of employees who have worked for our company for many, many years, 30, 40 years. Their parents might have worked for the company, their grandparents in some cases worked for the company. So there's that sort of strong sense of purpose that runs through the company. But more latterly, I think that the key thing for us really is that, we see, purpose as the thing that really drives the performance of the company. And you can't separate the two out. It's certainly not about profit in the sense of purely that, but purpose and performance are absolutely hand in hand. And I think where some companies maybe get it slightly wrong is they think purpose is all about CSR. Of course, it is about lots of important things around community and those things, but purpose should be about the core of your company and what you're trying to achieve,
beliefs.
Which is one of the reasons why we've reinvented ourselves as this sort of a healthier company, because making healthier ingredients, because we feel that is the right purpose for us going forward into the 21st century. And I think, the thing about purpose for us is it's authentic and it's credible within our company. We actually took a slightly strange and different approach to how we actually introduced it to our company. We worked out what our purpose was, and then we didn't say anything to anybody for 2 years. We just basically started talking about purpose to all our employees across the world, in town halls, video calls, whatever it might be, when we were talking with them. And we got them used to the idea of what we thought our purpose was and what we were trying to be as a company moving forward. And it was only 2.5 years after we'd actually started that seeding process with our own people that we actually said, by the way, this is our purpose. And then they automatically said, yeah, I get that. I believe that, because we've been talking about that for 2 years. Of course it is, yeah. It meant a lot to us. Also, I think the important thing with purpose in our particular case is that it's connected to the values of the company. And I know companies talk about values and integrity and all these sort of things. But, if you go around any of our business, anywhere in the world, whether it be Brazil or China or in America, I would be very disappointed if all our employees don't know what our purpose is and don't talk about what they're doing to live it. It is very much embedded in the business. And so it means a lot to us. And I think it really drives what we do. It's part of all our decision-making processes at the board, at our executive committee. We talk about it a lot. If you look at all the products that we've come out of our innovation pipeline over the last 10 years, every single one of those is effectively purpose-driven, either more sustainable or more healthy, or provide some sort of additional functionality to food. And so it's really become core in our business. And, that hasn't happened overnight. And I come back to this long-term thing. It was kind of already there, but it's taken us probably about 8 years of basically embedding it, ingraining it in the culture of the business to ensure that it is part of everything we do rather than just lip service.
Yeah, like purpose and values and beliefs, like they're all intertwined, but equally values and beliefs aren't to be pinned on a wall and forgotten about. They're to be lived and breathed in all that you do. Yep. So if you could give me a listing of what your key values are, and also some concrete examples of the specific business decisions and impacts that you've driven through the work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, our values are safety, respect, and integrity. But I mean, as you say, they're words, but they mean a lot to us as a company. But what we have done is we've set up a series of frameworks and metrics where, we can judge, are we actually living our purpose? And they are based around sort of 3 broad areas. One is about sort of, actually supporting the health agenda that we like to think our products are promoting, so supporting healthy living. And we've done loads of things under that. That's not just that our products obviously are already being consumed by millions of people every day that help them sort of have a healthier life, but also we support a lot of programs around the world that promote healthier living. Let me give you an example. So last year we brought together customers, but also members of the government, members of NGOs and other industry associations in the United Arab Emirates, for example, to do a long sort of 6-week course on sugar reduction, why it's important, how it can be done, how you actually reformulate food. People think reformulating food is quite simple. Taking sugar out is an incredibly complex thing to do. Sugar has a lot more properties than just sweetening. It can add shelf life, it can add moisture, it can add stability. And the minute you take it out, effectively the food can fall apart or it doesn't taste obviously the same. So actually reformulating it so that it has the same taste or better taste with a bit of luck and also works for the consumer is quite a skill and an art. So we do a lot of training on this. We do a lot of courses, not just with customers, but as I said, with industry associations, with government organizations, NGOs as well. We have set up a free to access nutrition, what we call Nutrition Center on the internet, which has a huge amount of research, blogs. It has views from various independent scientists about a lot of the ingredients that go into food so that people can understand a bit of the science behind that. That's accessible to all. We don't hold that ourselves. We publish that so that the world can, any consumer can have a look at that. So there are a lot of things that we do. We have, I said, some metrics that we use. We try and measure how much sugar we're taking out of the world through our low or no calorie sweeteners and our fibers. And over the last 3 years, 2.5 years, we've taken over 5 million tons of sugar out of products that we have reformulated. We look at the various programs we support around the world, which not just help people understand about the benefits of nutrition, but also promote more active lifestyles, particularly around physical exercise, because obesity and diabetes is a key issue, and it's not just food, although food is a huge part of it. It's also lifestyle and exercise and all those things as well. It's diet and exercise.
Yeah, because I was going to say, recently there was I think it was the WHO that brought out a report that talked about how obesity rates are likely to double by 2030 with the highest rises in low-income countries. So kind of bearing in mind the expertise that you guys have and the partnerships that you're forming at this point in time, what specifically are you doing in and around, maybe like policy, strategy change to kind of address that piece? Because obviously exercise is one thing, but nutrition is so much more.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're absolutely right. I mean, about 40% of all adults globally are overweight, and 13% of those are roughly obese. And in children, it's also a huge issue as well. 39 million children, I believe, or roughly 40 million children under the age of 5 are overweight or obese in the world as well. So it's a big issue. We have a dedicated regulatory team, as we call it, who work with regulatory authorities around the world to help them to understand the importance of reformulation, talk about labeling that might help the consumer to understand what they're consuming, and to work about how we can actually reduce sugar in products. And some countries are very good; they have mandated programs. Others less so. It's a continual process, and I think there are differences around the world. A lot of that is due to obviously different diets, different regional taste profiles. Latin America has quite strong labeling requirements around sugar, salt, and fat, and so that drives different behaviours for the customers that we work with. In Asia and Latin America, in USA and Europe, it's slightly different. So, I think it's something that we are, obviously it's very important to us. All the products we make in our sweetener portfolio, are used to reduce sugar or calories in products. And we're continually innovating and trying to bring new products to the market, which have no or low calories or can be used in a way that will help people to manage their weight in a way which obviously will benefit them over the long term.
I think one of the things that's interesting to explore as well is bearing in mind the cost of living crisis that we are currently situated within. And then we see things like the various different banks like SVB and the challenges that they face, and people looking at the potential of another crash, and more of like we are in recession at this present point in time. Price is a key impact for people's decision making. So some people, through no desire or exception of their own circumstances, they often, if you can go to somewhere like McDonald's and pick up a burger for like couple of pound or something versus go and actually have a healthy meal, the decision point is down to cost. It's to eat or not to eat. And how are you, I guess, as a business addressing the impact of cost to provide value within society?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in our particular case, most of our products that go into the final product consumed by the person on the street, we only put about less than 5% of the overall cost of the product is our ingredient. It's usually the ingredient that creates the real functionality. It either allows you to take out the sugar or adds a fiber, whatever, but it's a very small part of the overall cost. So our ingredients per se don't necessarily increase the cost of food in a material way. However, what we are seeing completely, as you say, Peter, cost of living is a huge issue in many, many countries. And what we're seeing is a lot more customers coming to us and saying, can you optimize the product to reduce the cost but keep the taste? And so we do see more of that today than we have seen previously. So that's where you take out some of the current ingredients in the product and you replace it with slightly cheaper ones, not because they necessarily work any less or taste any worse or the functionality isn't there, but they just reformulate them to optimize the cost for the customer and obviously for the end consumer. So we do a little bit more of that, and that's part of our skill set. But generally, from our point of view, we are a very small part of the overall cost of the final product. So, we're not necessarily affecting the overall cost for the consumer, but we recognize it's an important thing. And one of the things we do in our sort of social impact program is we have partnerships with many food banks around the world. And, we've seen a huge increase in people going to food banks in the last, since COVID started, quite frankly, and now from the cost of living crisis. And we've provided over 3 million meals in the last 2.5 years to food banks across the world for people in need in our local communities. And, it's been a great effort, but it isn't enough because we're seeing increasing demand. So this is an issue that's going to carry on for some time. There's no doubt about that. And the cost of food, to be honest, is going up. And I think over many, many years, we've got used to food being, as a proportion of household spend, being less and less, mainly because, the big retailers have price wars and all those sort of things. And I think that, now we're seeing the proportion of food costs going higher into people's, spend in the household. And that's probably something that's going to stick around for a while. I don't think that's necessarily going to change in the short term because some of those structural issues aren't going to move quickly. But it's very painful for people because obviously you've got energy costs and other costs at the same time. So it's really difficult, and we recognise that.
But I think this is where we kind of, partnerships are key, but then so is policy. So if we look back into like what takes place at the moment, you can look at things like a windfall tax, but actually tax 100% of those windfall profits and actually utilize that money to, increase, say, like the national minimum wage. And then that would actually provide people more money in their pockets to actually purchase the food and resources that are needed in their day-to-day lives, rather than kind of what we see at the moment. There is an evident rise in inequalities throughout the world, and I think that we can address some of the means, but until we address the root causes and work together as a collective, back to the long path discussion before, then I think sadly a lot of these issues will continue to perpetuate, which I do think there is another way out. And I think the more people start talking about values, beliefs, and actually looking towards driving impact within the world, then we've got a real good opportunity ahead of us as to drive the change that we all want to see. So, like, I'm one of those glass half full type of characters. I'm still optimistic as to what's coming, but equally, you need to be creating those levels of partnerships within society, within your company, to kind of galvanize movements for change. And that's what I'm encouraged by.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm an optimist as well, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think, look, the food industry in the UK, for example, since the last 5 years, if you had the average shopping basket, you would see products certainly from that have less calories. I think it's about 10% less calories, about roughly 12% less sugar, about 16% less salt. It is moving. The question is, how do we accelerate that? How do we make it healthier for people, and how do we move quicker? It's difficult in the food industry because of food safety and all the things we have to go through. But I think that, how do we make it more accessible? And I think one of the things we talk about here at Tate Lyle for the long term is how do we make nutrition more accessible for everyone? And I think that's going to be one of the key things. And going back to your earlier question about the long term and looking for the long term, one of the things that we've done twice actually in the last 4 years is, rather than looking at our strategy on a very short-term basis, which obviously you have to do, what's the environment for the next year, 3 years, 5 years, we've taken a lot of a big sort of deep dive into what do we think the world will look like in 10 years' time, and how can we adapt our business to ensure that we are in a strong position and are serving society in the way we want to in those 10 years' time. And it's a fascinating exercise to look back effectively from the future.
Yeah.
And, all I can say is in 2009, we looked at a number of scenarios, and pretty well 2 or 3 of them happened in the space of about 2 years. Mm-hmm. One, of course, was the COVID pandemic. And the other, I suppose, was the massive acceleration and understanding of the impact of climate change. And there was healthy food and all these other things as well. And I think we've just done that exercise again, actually, because we thought it was such a healthy exercise to do for the next 10 years. And what do we see as some of the challenges? And how do we feed the world with not just enough food to keep people alive, but also nutritious food to keep them well, is really important. And I think, there is a sort of a widespread public perception, I suppose, that good food tastes bad and bad food tastes good, if you see what I mean. And I think what we are on a mission to do, and what we're trying to do, is to reverse that. Our job is to take, healthy food and make it tastier for people, and to take tasty food, which sometimes can be perceived as bad for you, and to make it healthier. And that is literally what our products do. That's what our scientists do. That's what our R&D is all about. That's what our pipeline for innovation is all about. And I think that, that won't happen overnight, but it's something that is happening, but it needs to probably accelerate if we're going to meet societal needs. And because I think also, Peter, we're all more aware of the issues more than we ever have been before, because of the availability of information, technology, 24-hour news, whatever you want to call it. Even for my youth, I didn't have a mobile phone, the internet wasn't there. So maybe I didn't think about those issues as much as people do now. And if we want to employ the best talent, the best scientists, the best people into our business, and we have some very talented and very good people in our business today, we need to be a company that is clearly purpose-driven, that is going to try and solve these issues going forward, because most people, in the 20s or in their teenage years, they see the challenges ahead. We're leaving them with a terrible world at the moment unless we do something about it. And they want to work for companies that actually are going to try and solve that issue. Now, we're a very small cog in a very large wheel, but we're determined to do our bit and to play our part. And, we feel that we're changing our business to do that. And there are other things now we need to do more on to make that even better than it is today.
Yeah, for sure. I think from your reflective piece, I think I'd like to dive into some of the opportunities that you highlighted, but equally there's that Ray Dalio motto of like pain plus reflection equals progress. If businesses aren't prepared to reflect upon the journey that they've had to this point in order to kind of look towards the future as a world of opportunity rather than a world of destruction, then we have an opportunity to really galvanize people, and it loops back to what we said at the beginning about values and beliefs. Like, purpose isn't just something that you pin or something that you write a report on. It's actually ensuring that your values and beliefs align with your current staff, your communities you serve, and also they're articulated in such a compelling way to future hires that you attract the best talent available. So when it comes to decision making, people come to you because they are aligned to your values and beliefs. They're aligned to the goal of addressing the world's most pressing problems that we face, rather than kind of anything else. And money and everything like that just follows. That's a secondary issue. The key part is, what are your visions? What are your hopes? What are your viewpoints that are going to? You mentioned being a small cog, but like, without small actions from a collective group of people, and it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be, doing some good, and a lot of businesses and a lot of companies and a lot of people doing it, and then forming partnerships off the back end of that. That is when we'll start to see the progress that we want to see in the world. And I think, there's an awful lot of good, back to the glass half full mentality. There's an awful lot of good coming. Like, technology is available in such a way that we can be even more productive. We operate within a globalized world. So in that respect, communication, conversation, knowledge is available 24/7, and that is also a good thing. But it's what we use, it's what we do with that knowledge, what we do with that insight to kind of drive it towards a positive future for all. And that's my hope and dream, that like more people get on board with this longer term journey rather than kind of just be worried about these short term intertidal moments.
Well, we need to have a long term journey. We need politicians, we need chief executives, we need strategic thinkers to basically be prepared to set a long-term path, and that is something which some do but some don't. I think that it's one of the biggest challenges. I think it's like one of the two biggest challenges for companies and maybe other stakeholders going forward in the next 10 years. One is setting that strategic pathway and not deviating when things go wrong. It's one of the great admiration, actually, from I've worked for 4 chief executives at Tate Lyle over 23 years, and the third one, Rowan Adams, who really sort of kick-started the change. He sold the sugar business in the UK, and then latterly Nick Hampton, who's really done a fantastic job of taking the purpose-driven business forward. But Jarvid, we had some profit challenges about a decade ago, and even though we had to sort of deal with that in the market and shareholders and all those sort of things, we didn't really deviate on the long-term path that we'd set ourselves. We said, we are going to transform this business. We're going to keep on buying businesses that are making the right products for us, whether it be stevia leaves or whether it be protein companies or whatever it might be. We're going to keep on doing that, and we're going to sell off the businesses we don't think are part any longer of what we want to be as a company going forward, despite the fact we've got to deal with all this noise because we've had a bit of a profit dip. And that is sometimes the real challenge for companies, that that you have to deal with the short term, investors, other media, whatever it might be, and it blows you off course. And then before you know it, you're actually going down a tangent or a cul-de-sac, and your core strategy is kind of wrecked. And that's when you bring someone else in and they tend to change the strategy, and you don't get that long-term thinking. That's the first thing that's really important, that people plot the right path and stick to it for the next 10 years if we're going to solve these issues. And the second one for me is partnerships. And you said it in your a couple of minutes ago when you talked about some of the challenges, and if we're going to really solve climate change, we're not going to solve it as individual companies or individual governments. We're all going to have to work together. There's got to be a convergence of sort of politics, society, NGOs, universities, scientific organizations. We've all got to come together and work together somehow to ensure that we deal with a lot of these issues, and we need to show some flexibility and agility, and we have to look at technology in a different way. And just give you a really basic example, I was listening to the radio this morning to the Tape Today program as I came into work, and they were talking about politics, green parties in various parts of the world. And they were saying that in Finland, which has got a strong Green Party, and they're talking about the election that's just been held there, that the Green Party there are now supportive of nuclear energy, and they're supportive of GMO crops. Not because, which is quite surprising because that's not something you'd expect, but they see that as a way to get to, we have to compromise sometimes and use science to get to, a carbon-free society and to be able to feed people. And, I think that science and technology is the answer. We have to embrace that. We will not solve these issues without science and technology. And I think that, we probably don't invest enough in that in this country. We've got some great food scientists. We've got some great scientists in general, but I think R&D could be the real heartbeat of this company. Most of it gets exported rather than kept within. And, certainly in the food industry, science and technology is going to be the way we're going to feed the world in 10 years' time. I mean, we're going to have, as I said, we're going to go from 8 to just under 10 billion people by 2050. 2 billion of those people will be over 60 and will be people that will be looking to, try and keep healthy in their old age. Population growth is a huge challenge for society and for companies and how they're going to address it. I had this wonderful fact the other day that someone told me, which was that, the king or the queen in the past used to send a telegram to someone who's 100 years old. This was started apparently in 1917 by George V. Do you know how many people, Peter, that he sent telegrams to in 1917?
Probably a handful.
24. Do you know how many, they reckon they'll be sending telegrams to whoever's king in 2050, if we still have one, it'll be over 50,000. And so, and it was about 15,000 in 2020. So we're just seeing this massively aging and larger population. And that aging population will have issues around health and obesity and diabetes particularly. And so how are we going to adapt our food and the way we manufacture food, the way we formulate food to make sure those people stay healthy and don't have a huge impact on the cost of the National Health Service and other areas as well. So there's lots of different strands that are going to need to come together. And government, obviously, we hope or should be pulling these strands together. But I'm not sure that in the world we live in today, that is necessarily going to happen in the way that we would like. And so I think businesses particularly are going to take a real leading role in a lot of these areas because they see this as part of their ability to impact society and to impact the world going forward, and also to help their business to stay relevant and grow. And so I think it's going to be a very interesting 10 or 20 years ahead of us. And I'm optimistic because I believe that, in humanity's ability to sort things out and in the good of humanity, if I put it in that way. But it's going to need cooperation between a lot of pressure groups and a lot of different interested parties, which maybe we haven't seen in that way in the past. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge. And, there are some companies out there, I hope, who are going to really take a lead for that. And Tate Lyle, I hope will be one of those.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you in respect to the companies taking a lead. Like, the evidence is there. You just need to look at things like the Alderman Trust Barometer and see how over the course of the years that have passed, there's an actual loss of trust capital in governments, in media, etc. And it's up to almost the leaders, CEOs, CFOs to become the last bastions of trust. There's loads of data on that. But equally, the ability to in order to found and maintain trust, you have to kind of maintain a little bit more stoicism as to your pathway forward. There's not be like so easily put off course with short-term turbulence that may occur. And I think when we start to see more businesses, and even from an investment perspective, when people understand that actually, in respect to the geopolitical environment we live and operate within at this present point in time, investments may peak and trough quite an awful lot more than what they used to. But key is like to look towards to invest in leaders that are willing to not just articulate what a brighter, more prosperous vision for the future may be, but equally have kind of coined and intertwined that within the actions that they do. Like, one of the elements that I think is important to talk about is the importance of ESG, but equally, you talked. We've had a bit of a chat in between, but you talked about the opportunities of that reflective piece, and I keep on wanting to chat about that piece before we move on forward. So when you did actually do that exercise that you mentioned, that that forward-thinking exercise, what were the key opportunities that you as a leadership team were highlighting in respect to the land ahead?
I mean, there were a number of areas, and obviously some are specific to Tate & Lyle's business. But I mean, I think, we looked very much at the need to really understand what agriculture looks like in 10 years' time and sustainability of agriculture. Tate & Lyle, although a relatively small company, we actually founded and still operating at the moment the largest regenerative agriculture program in the US that's running today. It's about 1.4 million acres of corn. And that's measuring loads of different factors, about 29 different sustainability factors, including greenhouse gas emissions, soil health, wind erosion, and all those things on these 1.4 million acres, or every part of every acre. By coming back to the partnership point, we partnered with effectively a West Coast IT company, a data company, who had this great technology that can measure all these things, and they work with the farmers. We also have a very successful agricultural program in China for stevia, where we work with smallholder farmers there to try and decrease the amount of fertilizer they use so that they have less greenhouse gas emissions. And actually, not only have we reduced greenhouse gas emissions on those farms by about 50%, but the yield's gone up by 6% because they're just farming in a better way. So we saw long term, how can we, if we're going to really make an impact on climate change, if we're really going to have a value chain that is actually operating in a much more responsible way, you might say, a supply chain, sustainable agriculture is a key area. So we looked at that in a lot of detail. We looked at other areas like, I suppose for the sake of a better term, different types of food, so alternative food, if you can call it that. And I don't mean sort of strange science-driven sort of stuff. What I do mean is protein and different types of food, plant-based food in many cases. And how can we use technology and science, whether that be fermentation or other types of entomology or separations technology or whatever things that we're very good at, to try and find ways to engineer food, and that's maybe the wrong word to use, engineer food, but to create food which is still healthy, still tastes fantastic, still provides the consumer with all the provenance, the traceability, and the sustainability they want, but is available and more accessible in a bigger way, and is something which can replace maybe meat or other areas which are becoming less popular because of their environmental impact. So there were lots of things we looked at that we think could really help us. Different types of substrates. So we make most of our everything we make comes from a plant, a tree, or is grown in the ground. But we were looking at different types of crops. Some crops that we make products from today, which are very successful, but maybe in the future we can find different ways to make different ingredients. So we were just looking ahead very much. And I suppose one of the things that was slightly different from the first time we did that exercise a few years ago, and then when we did it again recently, was that some of the things that we thought were going to be 10 years ahead were kind of already happening now. When a few years ago we looked ahead and some of the things we identified weren't already happening. The world is moving so quickly. And I do think that the most recent issues around, or the crises in the world, such as COVID, obviously the Ukraine crisis, and all the volatility we're seeing in the markets, whatever it might be. I mean, we're quite frankly living from one crisis to another at the moment. I think that's really accelerated a lot of this thinking with a lot of companies, a lot of people, because, we've had to work in a different way. We've had to think in a different way to survive and to grow and to continue being a successful business. And I think the need to look ahead is greater now than it's ever been because the world is so uncertain.
Yeah.
And you have to be more agile. You have to be more flexible. If you have a very rigid way of doing things, the reality is something will come on from the outside and probably wreck your business.
Yeah, flexibility is definitely a key word. I think if you look at it, even from the discussion about hybrid working, remote working, like it's not about providing a one or the other, it's about providing flexibility. And if you look also at the challenges that we had post-pandemic, whilst an awful lot of us lost loved ones and the ability to kind of work through those grieving steps, it was a period of grand awakening for an awful lot of people. They did start looking holistically at the challenges faced ahead of them. We talked earlier on about rising populations, but if you just apply that to the evolution of where food will go, like we're going to go to more of a plant-based diet, because like it's if we follow and plot the graph the way that it's going to be plotted, then there is insufficient space to create meat at such a level that's going to allow people to, have it accessible without doing these kind of crazy, unethical ways of production. And I think that is just a natural thing. And also there are future benefits that are shifted in that respect. There's a lot can be said about the longevity of life, the healthy ability of life, the gut health, and all that sort of jazz. Like, it's not about persuading people to do one or another. It's just about people having a flexible approach to their view of where things are evolving to, and not be kind of camped in one camp and, say this is where I'm staying. Like, be prepared to be flexible, to move with the seas of change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we take flexibility and hybrid working very seriously. We had a huge awakening during COVID, and over 40% of our top 500 managers are all women. A lot of them at a family age with young children, as is a lot of obviously our male employees as well. And the flexibility between the two parents and whatever to work in a different way, that's here to stay. That's not going to change. Yeah, we have I think very good, certainly completely different to when I started work, policies on how we can make sure that people can work in a hybrid way, they can work in a flexible way. Obviously, we have plants where people have to work shift work, which is different, but in our offices, people can work, in a completely hybrid manner. They can work whatever hours suit their family needs or their personal needs. So we're very flexible on that, and it's really helped us. And we've brought a lot of people into the company on the back of that. It's been very interesting, actually, particularly at a younger age. But just going back to your point about, if you look at the food industry, recently there was I think it was about 2 weeks ago, there was the IPC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which came out from which is sort of the big report from the WHO. And their message on food was really about the need for more balanced diets with less meat in it. Obviously more plant-based food, more investment in green technology, and basically more crop-resilient innovations going forward. And that's what's going to really be the key to reducing emissions and to help agricultural yields, because that's the double whammy here. It's reducing emissions in the agricultural field and also at the same time increasing yield. That is what we're seeing in our sustainable agriculture programs in the US and Asia. That is what we're achieving, because you can't have one without the other. Because if you're a farmer, you're not farming for charity. You're farming to make money. And so if you can persuade them that by being more sustainable, by using a different type of slow release fertilizer or whatever it might be, not only are you going to save costs and you're going to have a better crop yield, then that's a win-win. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely important. So, you have to persuade people to do these things. And I think it just takes time, as we said. And I think that from our point of view, we're seeing real engagement from the agricultural world. We're seeing great engagement from our customers at the other end of the value chain, because most of us are in the same boat when it comes to making food and reducing climate change emissions. Because, in Tate Lyle's case, 87% of all our emissions come outside our four walls, so basically through our value chain, our supply chain. And many of our customers, it's not in the 90%. So you have to work in partnership, as we said earlier, with people who are supplying you or people you're selling your products to, if you really want to make a difference. And I think that is something we're beginning to see, and it's a lot of companies coming together. In some countries, governments are helping, in some countries it's less so, but it isn't stopping companies from doing the right thing. And I think it's why I'm optimistic about the future.
Yeah, I guess we're just within an era of education. Like, we need to educate people of what the scope really is and what the impacts really are, and in order for change to eventuate and change to come in, because the education piece, without telling people of the elements of sustainable agriculture or the impacts of geopolitical in respect to the exportation of grain from Ukraine or the wider implications, then people don't know. And if they don't know, then why would they be willing to change? So I think that's a key part. But equally, to change, there's the integration of ESG. So I'm looking to kind of learn a little bit more about how are you integrating ESGs in your business, and why is it important?
Well, look, I think, I'm not a great fan of the term ESG personally, just because an acronyms like that, people always think it's sort of tick box stuff. But actually, ESG, for what it really is, sustainability, it's inclusion, and it's obviously an element of governance as well. This is not a nice to have, or a nice to do. It is absolutely core part of a business's strategy. And anyone who says it isn't probably won't be around in 10 years' time, because it is. Yeah. No one is going to work for a company in 10 years' time that is not on at least a pathway to being a more sustainable business, or is not on a pathway to doing good in society. Well, very few people will, in my view. And so if you look at our investors, you look at our customers, you look at all stakeholders who interact with us as a company, they all see the same thing. It's a really important thing. We had a capital markets day recently where we get all our investors together and they hear presentations about the company. And we talked a lot about, our sustainability goals, what we were doing. Over the last few years, we've been completely eradicating the use of coal in all our businesses across the world operations. We completed that in 2021. It cost us about $150 million to do that. Not a single investor said that wasn't the right thing to do. I think, they get it. And I think people we work with get it as well. And it is really important. And I think in our company, we don't necessarily call it ESG. We call it sustainability because it has, or purpose, it has a wider meaning within the company. But, it is absolutely part of everything we do. So when we acquire a business, we take a very strong look at its business, obviously, its products, how sustainable it is, the way that it's used in the society, what benefits it can have. We look at it all very carefully. We look at our capital expenditure program when we're expanding our plants or we're putting new kit into our plants. What is the emissions impact going to be? How can we reduce that? How can we recycle more water if we're going to be using more water rather than drawing it from local sources? We look at all those things. In our innovation pipeline, as we produce new products, we look at, is it a purpose-driven product? Is it something that's going to really improve people's lives by giving them better choices when they go and shop, by taking out calories, fat, whatever it might be from the product, or sugar, and adding in other good stuff like fiber and protein? Tate Lyle is the world's largest producer of dietary fibers, soluble dietary fibers, which people don't realize at all. And it's a fantastic product. 25 grams a day is everyone's lowest recommended intake of fiber. And there's no one in virtually any country that is nameable, the UK, US, Brazil, China, you name it, where anyone is getting that 25 grams a day. And you talked earlier about gut health and the human microbiome. We put a lot of research into that area as part of our sort of ESG program, if you could put it that, by researching through universities and other organizations the clinical impact of impact on the gut health of fiber and other products. Because I think one of the great changes now we see is that people understand that actually what happens around your stomach and your microbiomes is actually as important to your health as anything in your body. And, rather than killing them by using antibiotics, which obviously is something that for many years people have recognized as being the right thing to do, and in some cases it still is, but generally you should be feeding those biomes to help give you immunity. And I think what we've seen is, since COVID particularly, a real increase in people wanting to improve the immunity of their body, to eat healthier food, to ensure that they can resist things that may happen to them, or disease in the future, or malnutrition, or gut issues, or digestion issues. And we've seen a real increase in the understanding and intake of fiber as a result. And so we look at lots of different areas. ESG to us is a broad part of it's part of the core part of the business. And it's in our innovation pipeline, it's in our capital decisions, it's in what the board does, how they think about the business. It's very much the hard core of the business. And ESG is a kind of a way of describing it to the outside world. But for us, it's our purpose, yeah? It's what we do, yeah? And I think if you have that connection, then, it's sort of, I sometimes find I have to explain it to people as if it's something separate, when actually it's quite difficult to do because it isn't separate. It's part of what we do every day.
I guess anybody listening to this, and I get this a lot when I start talking about the work that I do, a lot of people look at the challenge that's ahead of us, and they kind of feel a little bit overwhelmed by the whole landscape of the challenge. So similarly to the questions that I get, I'd like to spin this back on you. How do Tate and Lyle leadership team manage the near-term needs of the business while maintaining a focus for the long-term strategy?
I think it's not easy. I can tell you that it's not easy. But I think we've got two or three things that we collectively agree. I mean, we have an executive management team and I've been here for many years, so I've seen a few of these teams. But the current team that Nick has recruited and has put in place, we are collectively, unanimously purpose-driven people, or we believe that's the right thing for the company. There's no dissension on that at all. That is very important. You need a collective management team that absolutely, and a board as well, by the way, they're very supportive, that all believe in the same thing. Because the minute you have that fractured or fragmented, which I have seen in the past, it's very destructive, and you don't achieve what you want to achieve. So collectively, we're all in the same place, and that's to Nick's credit that he's brought a team together who believe that. I think the second thing is we spend quite a lot of time looking at the long term, and we kind of trust each other. Because look, short-term delivery, Pete, let's be honest, yeah, we're a listed PLC. We put out trading statements every quarter. We have half-yearly financial reporting. If we don't hit our targets, we are going to suffer. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. So we have to deliver in the short term. We get that, and we review it obviously on a constant basis. But I think that we spend a lot of time talking about the long term. We kind of trust each other to deal with the short term, you might say, and as a team. But we do set aside a lot of time as an executive management team and as the wider leadership team of Tate & Lyle, like the top 100 rather than just the top 8, to think about the long term and to talk about the long term and to plan for the long term. Maybe we have some advantage in the fact that, we're quite a capital intensive business. We've got large manufacturing plants. And when we put expansions in, or we have to build a new plant or whatever it might be, this will take 2 or 3 years to actually happen. So we plan over a 3 to 5, 7 to 10 year period anyway as a business, because that's the nature of what we do. Obviously, we have to course correct. We have to be agile, as we said earlier, if things change in the meantime, like the Ukraine crisis or COVID. But the fundamentals of what we do is very much looking at both the short and long term in parallel, not necessarily basically favouring one over the other at any given time. And I think, it's not easy. And there are times when, it's a challenge, but, I think it is doable. And, you have to stay very close to your markets. You have to stay very close to your customers. You have to really understand them. We spend, a fair amount of time and investing a lot of money in really understanding what's happening in the world around us, so we can see those trends and adapt accordingly. We've just all got to be really passionate for the business. And, I think, and this sounds sort of, slightly evangelical, but, people in our leadership team here, we all believe in what we're doing. You can see that in what people say and how they act, the commitment they have. They truly believe in it. And, that's really important as well. And as I said, I haven't always seen that in the past. But we have a unanimous team that really believes in what we're doing. It's very, very much aligned to our purpose and our values. And so, that gives us the best chance possible of driving the company through the next few years in a successful way and growing the business, as we have done over many years in the past anyway. So I think it's a cultural thing, it's a people thing, and it's just making sure that we don't drop the ball in the short term, and that will allow us the ability to plan for the long term.
Yeah, I guess
that makes sense.
Yeah, no, 100%. I was listening to what you were saying, and I was thinking, we've talked a lot throughout this podcast about purpose, why it's important, how you kind of came to that decision point, but it's more evident than just from a strategic perspective. Like, there's a picture of my son behind me, and we've got twins as well now. Like, for me, that was the change point when I had children, and the reality of, I'm 40 this year, right? So I've gone through decades of listening to people talk about global warming to climate change and just not doing anything about it. And I thought, well, for me personally, I've got children. I don't want them to inherit the world that we live in at the moment. I want to galvanize people to be part of a solution rather than perpetuate the problem. So, like, purpose, it has more close-knit fibers than simply from a strategic perspective. Like, in order to maintain that vision, that desire, that strive towards the long term, you have to link it to something from an emotional factor that really means something to you. So,
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more, Peter. And I think Nick won't mind me saying that one of the things that pushed him to really think about the environmental agenda in a bit more forceful way was his teenage daughter saying to him, "So what are you doing in your company to make the world a better place from an environmental perspective, climate change?" And, he felt that we weren't doing enough, and he couldn't really answer that question. This was a few years ago. And that drove him. So I think, it's those small things which do make a difference. I think from my point of view, I have 3 children, they're all grown up, but, I want them, if they have children, to have a better... I think one of the things that worries me is that, and I think we've talked a little bit about this in the cost of living crisis in the media and things, is that, if you look back over the last, hundreds of years, every generation has usually been, in most cases, in a better place than the generation before.
I know the point you're about to make.
Yeah, well, you know the point I'm going to make, which is, we're a little bit in danger here that the next generation is going to be worse off than the generation.
Well, they are, like the statistics.
Well, I think they will. Yeah, well, we can change that. We can do things to make it better. Maybe, I'm just being an optimist like you saying, but I think we're moving in that direction. And then maybe the generation after that, which is even worse, you could see far ahead and say they will be even worse off because of what we're doing to the planet and some of the challenges that we potentially face as humanity. And so I think that is something which, should worry us and should spur us into action. What you said earlier is absolutely right. No one's sitting here thinking that we can all change the world individually. We're not the President of the United States or the Prime Minister or whatever. But, we can play our part. And if everyone plays their part collectively together, we will make a huge difference and we will move the world in the right direction. And I think that is what I say to people inside Tate Lyle. I say, look, you might sit there and think this is such a big issue and what can I do? And so what we do is we talk to a lot of people about the part that you can play, but also about being brave and experimenting and, not worrying about making a mistake necessarily, but trying to do something that could make a difference. And if you try 4 things and 1 works, you're probably going to make a difference that is really positive. And when we started our purpose journey, as I mentioned earlier about those sort of 2 years when we didn't really talk about it, what we did do at that time was we set up a lot of experiments. And when I say experiments, I don't mean like chemical experiments. What I mean is we started sponsoring some schools to measure their levels of obesity in China. We started to look at how we could potentially reduce the calorific level of some of the products we were making in those days. We looked at various other ways we could come together with other NGOs to build better understanding of health and nutrition education in certain countries. I look back at those experiments and I'd probably say that only probably 1 or 2 of them actually worked in the space of about 2 years. But that didn't matter because what it did was it made people start to think about some of the issues and actually we could make a difference. And even though we tried and it didn't quite come off, it actually laid the foundation for what we are today, because I think now you see in our innovation pipeline, you see in our scientists, you see it in the work we do in the communities, you see it on our sustainability agenda, people trying different things, people actually taking personal action, whether it be, biking into work rather than commuting in a car, small things, but actually they're doing it because they feel in a place where they are being supported to take action to do something better for society. And that makes me feel incredibly proud. And talking about, different generations, the company today that we are, I've loved working for Tate Lyle for the 23 years, but I'm really proud of the company we are today. And I think that we have left this company, we are leaving. And I'm in my 50s, I won't be here forever, but I will leave this company in a better place than when I joined it. And I just think that now we have a responsibility to do the same for the world around us.
Yeah, and I think that the ability to try, like it's better to try than not try at all. That's one part of things. And then equally, when we kind of look towards progressing forwards, there's just utilization of data. Like I talk to people a lot about things like the the debt as a percentage of GDP in the UK. If we go back to like 2010 levels, it was about 62.5%. Like now we're up about like 99 point something, sometimes touching over 100%, and that is crazy. That those levels are just unsustainable. But if we want to actually see progress in the world, then is these small steps towards a bigger goal, and understanding that you have to galvanize people towards change. And change in some cases can be seen as a nasty word. And I think, to be honest, there's a lot of people that are kind of latching onto purpose as the same type of thing. It's just this aspirational word that doesn't mean anything, but it's not about that. It's about stripping away a term and actually driving some impact and value behind the work that you do via the action that you deliver. And I think, when we start then tying that into our emotional fibers as to what really motivates us, what gets us out of bed, what do we want to see from the world and why, then we can drive an awful lot of positive change into people's lives. And when we tie that to communities, like I spoke to them a while ago, they're a great company called Tony's Chocolonely, and their business was really intriguing how they got started. It was started by a journalist that was like lobbying against basically what was taking place in that particular industry, and then he was just like, well, screw it, let's do it. I'm going to change, and I'm going to implement this. And he set up a chocolate company that are doing great things. Like their Tony's Premium is a really good thing from a value chain perspective, because not only, you get a level of monetary value as a farmer from fair trade, but then they level that up with a Tony's Premium cost. So they're paying people more money at the very beginning. So, right the way through the supply chain, it turns to a value chain because you're providing value into people's lives. And I was really galvanized by what they were doing and what they had to say. But equally, like, people do make mistakes. So, they've made a few mistakes along the line, but it's just to understand that, like, if you're trying to implement the change that you want to see in the world, then it's better to try than not try at all.
Totally agree. And I think, obviously Tate Lyle's been through this unbelievable transformation over the last 20 or 30 years, and that's huge change. It's like moving a super tanker around in completely different direction. But, in a lot of companies, a lot of places, it doesn't necessarily need change. It just needs more ambition. And I think that's something we talk about a lot here as well, which is about being more ambitious for what we want to achieve. And I think sometimes, as I said earlier, we're a small cog in a large wheel. And sometimes then you feel a little bit lost because you think, well, how can I really make a difference? Is really what I'm doing actually changing anything at all? And, what we sit there and say is, look, we need to be more ambitious. And if someone had said to me 5 years ago, we'd have set up the largest agricultural program for regenerative agriculture in the US 5 years ago, and I laughed at them saying, there's no way we can do that. But by finding a good partner, by finding people who are willing to really go the extra mile, we managed to do it. And it's a great example of the things that you can do if you have a bit more ambition. And I think that's what, Nick is very good here at Tate Lyle. He's very strong on going around saying to people, look, I will support you, I'll back you. You're happy for you to do experiments and to look at different ways of doing things. I just want you to show ambition. I want you to really try and drive us to the next level of our purpose-driven agenda. And I think that's what a lot of companies do. And I love the story about the chocolate maker. I think it's just, there's so many great examples of that in the country. And I think, in the UK in particular, we have some specific issues, I think, compared to other countries that I travel to. But we still have this great sense of humanity, this great sort of entrepreneurship, people who want to do the right thing. A lot of the great initiatives that are happening around the world, it was started in the UK. And I just think that, we have a lot to offer. I think we need good leaders. And I think, we have a number of companies that have really good leaders who are sort of leading the way from a business perspective. I won't comment on politicians because that's too dangerous thing to do on a podcast like this. But, we probably need stronger leadership on long-term issues.
Yeah.
And I think we'd all agree that. And that's not a UK-specific issue. It's in many countries in the world, particularly Western democracies, actually, where everyone's obsessed by being re-elected rather than actually taking decisions that will not necessarily impact their performance, but will impact the future. And that's a difficult thing for any politician to do, to be honest. But I think, purpose is, purpose done right in the right way by companies, when they really embed it with their employees, where they truly believe in the purpose of the company, it's the most powerful thing you can see. And I think certainly in the last 8 or so years at Tate Lyle, since we've really driven the purpose agenda, even though it was probably a sleeping dog beforehand, it's made a massive impact to the culture of the business and to what we've achieved. And look at what we've achieved in the last 8 years. We've had good financial performance, and we've also completely transformed the company, not just through the asset base, but also the way we operate, the kind of people we employ, and the way we work. I'm sitting in a hybrid office. So we have no officers here. Chief executive sits next to me in open plan. If I thought that was going to be the case 10 years ago, I'd have laughed. Yeah. So I think, you can change, you can adapt, and it can be better. But we need to collectively try and move the needle forward on lots of big issues. And if we just look like we feel we can't do that, then we've got a problem. We need to try and work together to make it happen.
Yeah, I guess there's 2 more questions that I'd like to ask, but of just before I dive into those, we just ultimately need leaders to lead on change and to be more ambitious in their expectations of what they can drive and deliver, and equally do that grounded around a place of care for communities, for people, for planet. And when we do that, then any decisions that we make is ultimately for the betterment of people and planet, and that's the goal, right? We're not going to solve any of these most pressing problems unless we kind of harker that back to a central aim of these big aspirational goals, and understand that it's not about seizing the day, it's about seizing the decade, and spending time in and around the often boring tasks of delivery, consistency, accountability, transparency, all those good things. Keep and maintain with that, and we will eventually see, back to glass half full type of characters, we'll eventually see the change that we want to need to see in the world, and that's only a good thing. I guess before we wrap it up, there's 2 questions. Like, one being, what are the biggest challenges for purpose-led companies within the next 10 years or so? And then equally, as a final question, what are the key thoughts and takeaways you'd like to leave with our audience?
I think I probably mentioned them earlier, the biggest challenges, but I think there are many, but I think the key ones are making sure that you have a long-term plan and you stick to it as far as you can, and not get diverted by storms in the short term, and having real commitment towards what you're trying to deliver and achieve, and being flexible as you go forward, but not actually changing that long-term plan, because I think that's absolutely critical, and that's particularly for management and boards. And I think the second one, the biggest challenge also is finding the right partners, or just finding partners in general, who you can work with constructively and collectively to really achieve some of your goals. And it's mutual goals, no doubt. Our customers, our suppliers, they have the same goals as us in many respects, to reduce their climate impact, or to have a more inclusive business, or to sell more products, or whatever it might be. So finding the right partners and working together, and that will be not just suppliers and customers, that will also be NGOs, that will be governments. I've talked a bit about our sustainability program in China, but that's run with Earthwatch Europe, a really great NGO. And we work also with a local agriculture university in Nanjing. What we do, and our Corn program is is a software company on the West Coast. So we can't achieve what we're doing without partners. Partnerships is important. People need to learn how to work in partnership. Not every company has necessarily the capabilities and the skill set to do that in the right way. So I think, keeping on the straight and narrow, keeping strong with your strategy over the long term, regardless of impacts in the short term, and building the right partnerships are going to be the key enablers towards driving your purpose over the long term, over the next 10 years. I mean, there's a laundry list of things I could say there, Peter, but those are probably the 2 things that come to mind as the most important to mention.
And we've talked a lot about galvanizing people towards a common cause. So I guess, what's the key thought and takeaway? What would you like to say to our audience as a final closing point?
I think we've covered a lot of areas, but for me, purpose it's a term, But actually, purpose is, I like to think of it as like the DNA of a company. And it's what gets you out of bed in the morning. It's what makes you proud to work for that company. And, I know so many people in Tate Lyle and also in other companies as well who love what they do. They love their company. They love what that company is doing. And I think if we can get everyone in that same place, every company, no matter what they do, even if they do things which at the moment some people see like oil and gas as a bad thing, over time can change. I mean, to be fair to BP and Shell, they're investing probably more in renewables than any other company in Britain, and yet they're sort of, demonized. They're going through the same transformation. It will take 20, 30, 40 years to make that happen. But I suspect by 2050, there'll be two of the largest electricity or renewable companies in the country. So I think that, it's about having that long-term plan. It's about ensuring that you really stick with it, as I said earlier, as one of the biggest challenges. And, it's part of life, whether it's your personal carbon footprint, whether it's your personal social impact, companies are no different. Purpose is just a way of expressing it, I suppose, in a way that people can understand it. And I think, personally, it's one of the greatest things that's happened to companies in the last few years that they've actually had to think about, and boards have had to discuss, why are we here? What are we here to do? Are we doing good? And asking all those sort of questions, it's incredibly healthy for any organization, company, or whatever it might be. And if you can answer all those questions in the right way, then you have something to build on. And, I think at Tate Lyle, we're still at the early stages of our journey, but we've made a really good start. We've got some great things going. We've reinvented the company into the company we want to be, but maybe in 20 years' time, we'll look very different as well, because we have to adapt to what's happening around us. But I just think that, purpose is a really important part now of the fabric of every business. And it gives me optimism and hope for the future that if people really embrace purpose, they can actually drive change in a very positive way, and will be giving the next generation a better world than the one that we inherit.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Peter. It's been great.
Thank you for listening to the Purpose Made podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to Purpose Made wherever you normally get your podcasts to hear the latest news and views. You can also find and follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn and Twitter, or contact Peter directly to connect, inquire about Purpose Made, or request to be featured on the podcast. We look forward to welcoming you back soon for another episode.